Hi, this is Gary with Aldan American. Today we're going to be installing our Mustang single adjustable coilover kit and rear shocks on our 66 Mustang behind me. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove our front wheel. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the inner panel off. There's 8 bolts, and it also is the bump stop, and it's a reinforcing panel that goes over the spring. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the upper shock mount. So we're going to take the bolts out and the nuts out, but we are not going to remove the studs yet. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 2 nuts on the bottom of the shock loose so the shock can come out the top. And what I've done is I put a little bit of pressure on the lower control arm so that when we start taking stuff apart here, there's no chance of the spring coming out. Now that we've removed the lower shock nuts, we can remove the shocks. So in order to remove the coil spring, I'm going to use this internal coil spring compressor so that we can safely remove the spring. The coil spring compressor does not fit through the hole as a assembly, so what I do is I take it apart. The lower's already in there. Now I'm going to take the upper and I'm going to hook the hooks onto the spring, and then I'll go underneath the fender and assemble everything in order to compress the coil spring. Now that we removed the coil spring, we are going to remove the spring seat. So there's nuts on the bottom side that you have to remove. The hex on the top is pressed into the T-bar so it does not spin, so you have to do it from the bottom side. Now that we removed the lower spring seat off of the upper A-arm, what we should now do is inspect the A-arm, make sure there's no damage or any cracks, because these are 50-plus-year-old cars. So the next thing we're going to do is put our new coilover upper brackets on. So what I've done is I've removed one of the studs, leaving the other 2 studs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the bracket in place, and I am going to put the nuts on. Then we're going to drill the first hole, and then we're going to take the stud out, put a bolt in here, and drill the second hole so that we can get all 3 holes drilled. On the 67 and newer cars, there's a second piece of sheet metal that's the upper spring pocket. On the earlier cars, it's a little bit easier to drill through because that second piece of sheet metal is not there. On the Mustangs, a lot of the cars have the export brace, or they've got some sort of a brace that mounts also off the upper shock bracket. So the factory style export brace fits on top. So what I normally would do in that case is I would not remove it from the firewall, just the 3 bolts here, lift the brace up, put the bracket in, set the brace on, and then bolt everything down like we did on this one, and then start drilling my holes. That way it keeps the relationship and everything in the correct order. So on the Mustang kit, we include 36 of the flat washers. Now the flat washers are designed to go inside of this pressing area where the T-slot bolt goes. So real typical between this plate and the gap here, it's going to take 2 to 3 washers. And the reason we put the washers in is so that when you go to tighten everything down, you're not going to distort the pressing in the frame, and everything will sit nice and flat. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put our lower plate in. So I've got the bolts, I put my washers on, I put the bolts in place, and I put a little bit of tape so that it holds it in so that when you're putting them in, the bolts don't fall off. So on this particular car, we found it's going to take 4 washers to fill the gap between the plate and the stamping on the inner fender well. So the reason we've put the nuts on the top side and the bolts going from the bottom up is so that there's no interference with the shock. So now we're going to take our coilover shock, we're going to install it from the bottom side up, and this particular bearing uses a spacer, so we want to make sure our spacers are in place, and that takes up the gap between the upper mount. So on the top of the shock is our rebound adjustment knob. So what I do is I start from the full counterclockwise position, and then I turn it clockwise 3 clicks. 1, 2, 3. And I use that as a starting point. That's a great place to start. Adjust it to your driving style and work with it from there. So for all of our 3/8 hardware, we're going to torque it to 30 foot-pounds. For the upper 1/2-inch shock bolt, we're going to torque that down to 50 foot-pounds. Now that the top is bolted together, we're going to assemble the lower. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bolts and I'm going to use one of the large flat washers on the top side. And then on the bottom side, I'm going to use the AN washers. Because of the way the arm is stamped, a full-sized washer does not fit underneath. Just like we did the upper 3/8 hardware, we're also going to torque our lower bolts to 30 foot-pounds of torque. So in order to set the ride height, we're going to use our spanner wrench. The first thing we want to do is use our Allen wrench to make sure the set screw is loose, and then we'll use the spanner wrench to make our adjustments. When we assembled these springs on these shocks, we included the thrust bearings. The thrust bearings are optional. It's part number ALD26, and it's a roller bearing with 2 bearing races on either side. So when you do this, it makes it a lot easier to adjust the ride height. Once we've set our ride height, we're going to take the Allen wrench and we're going to put it on the 1-piece spring retainer. There's a pinch bolt, and so what we're going to do is tighten it down, and I usually use the short end of the wrench, and once it's about as tight as you can tighten it with the short end of the wrench, that is sufficient to hold it in place. So now that we've got everything assembled and installed, what we're going to do is we're going to put it on the ground, we're going to drive the car around the block, and then we're going to measure the ride height to set the final ride height. So now we're going to do the rear shocks on our 66 Mustang. So inside the trunk, next to the back seat, is going to be the upper shock hardware, and the lower shock hardware is on the axle housing. So now we've removed our ugly yellow air shocks, we're going to assemble the new Aldan smooth body shocks. So we use a clevis on the top and on the bottom to simulate the studs top and bottom on the original shock. Now that we've installed our bolts on the bottom and tightened them up, there's these black washers, or they could be gold, that are included in the kit. And so what that does is it goes on the stud, and then that locates it to the hole in your floor pan and your lower shock plate. So I want to put the knob towards the inboard side. So now we're going to install the little washers, and there could either be the 2 gold washers that come in the kit, or there could be a single black washer. And so this black washer takes up the distance between the large hole and the post adapter. So when we tighten the top and the bottom post on the post adapter, what we're going to do is use a crescent wrench to keep it from spinning. So what we want to do is have the bolts going front to rear, so when the shock goes in and out of a driveway, it's articulating on the pivot of the bolt. So we're going to torque the post adapters down to 50 foot-pounds. So now that we have the shocks installed, what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the shocks. So I'm going to go full counterclockwise, and then I'm going to put 3 clicks of adjustment in it towards the firm side, and we'll use that as our starting point and go out and drive the car, see how it feels, and make adjustments to suit our driving style. Now that we've assembled everything, we're going to put our inner brace in place. For more information, check us out at aldanamerican.com.